But the crime of sexual abuse against women, she concluded, was indirectly the fruit of precisely this theology. Now, Catherine Bushnell went on to write a stunning feminist theology. And she had studied classics in college, and she taught herself Hebrew, and she was able to retranslate and reinterpret the entire scriptures. And she published her theology as God's Word to Women, first in installments in the 1910s, and then the kind of final edition in 1923. So let me ask another question. How many of you have heard of Kate Bushnell before? Awesome, one. We'll need to talk. So the rest of you, not at all. Neither had I, frankly. At least not before I discovered her through a winding trail of forgotten footnotes. It turns out that her career had spanned the period during which feminism and Christianity began to drift further and further apart. Now, to understand this, the kind of critical backdrop for our own historical moment, let's look to another woman, somebody that I'm guessing you've heard of before. She, like Bushnell, concluded that Christianity was working against the interests of women, and her name was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Heard of her? Yes? Okay, yeah, we're good there. Okay, so on one hand, women like Frances Willard had drawn large numbers of Christian women into the cause of women's rights, specifically suffrage. But many other Christians at the very same time, especially these Christian ministers that Sojourner Truth had encountered, remained very opposed to women's rights. Again, history is complicated here. So, to counter the conservative influence, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and fellow feminist friends published the Woman's Bible in the 1890s. Now, Stanton and her co-authors offered alternate interpretations of biblical texts that seemed to go against the rights of women. So in many ways, her project was similar to Bushnell's. However, she didn't have access to the original languages, and she did not respect the authority of the scriptures in the same way that Bushnell did. So when she and her co-authors found a passage that they couldn't really tweak to their satisfaction, they either rewrote it or just cut it out entirely. So you can see how this might have produced a fair amount of backlash against Orthodox Christians. In fact, some historians have concluded that the Woman's Bible actually became one of the most powerful weapons in the anti-suffrage arsenal because it linked women's rights with religious heresy for at least a generation, if not longer, probably to today. So one of the reasons that you haven't heard of Bushnell is that by the time she got around to publishing her theology, many within the women's movement had decided it was just best to avoid this contentious terrain of religion. Theology, it seemed, had become too dangerous, too disruptive in the wake of Stanton's Woman's Bible. But that did not mean that Christian women stopped being Christian feminists. In fact, Susan B. Anthony was a devoted Christian. Anna Howard Shaw, a Methodist minister, was one of the leading suffragists. And it was the support of Christian women, those ordinary Christian women, that helped secure the 19th Amendment in 1920. So we're upon the centennial of that right now. Celebrate that 100 years ago. However, it did mean that women like Bushnell would have a hard time finding a larger audience for their work. Making matters worse, there was the issue of sexuality. So the unity that could once be found between Christian women and women's rights advocates during the social purity movement, the social purity activists were called social purity feminists by historians. They were right at the center of the women's rights movement, understandably so. But by the early 20th century, we see a strain developing because of differing views of sexual morality and differing views of what's best for women. So by the early 20th century, more and more feminists started to think that the sexual double standard, which remained a problem, could be dealt with more effectively, not by trying to restrain male sexual activity. That was very hard to accomplish. but maybe by liberating female sexuality, and you can get equality that way. Think, for example, of the kind of first sexual revolution, the 1920s, flappers, right? That's what we're kind of talking about. Many Christian women, however, persisted in the view that Bushnell had held, and Bushnell lived through the 1920s into the 1940s, and women of her generation were saying, no, 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 you've got this all wrong. That is not the path to women's liberation at all. You are playing into the hands of abusive men and potentially an abusive state as well. They thought that women's empowerment could best be achieved through sexual restraint for men and for women. Now again, these women were not necessarily prudes. In fact, this whole idea of prudish Christian women, prudish Victorian women, emerged in the 1920s in this moment. It's kind of a historical construction. Now, if you look at the writings of some of these women, these Christian women who are arguing against sexual liberation, they didn't approve of the activities of the flappers, say, but they were also quite gracious in engaging with the younger generation and with the sexual revolution, frankly. They said, you know what, yeah, we don't condone this kind of sexual experimentation, but frankly, it's understandable that they are rejecting the Victorian moral system and the inequality at the heart of that, the sexual double standard, because that was profoundly immoral. And so they had this really kind of level-headed view of the sexual revolution in the 1920s, not the path to women's liberation as they saw it, but also kind of understandable. And they had a common enemy, and that was the sexual double standard. But there was this continuing divide between, particularly by this point, secular feminists and Christian feminists. But that wasn't even the only problem that women like Bushnell faced, because at the same time, we have to look at what's happening in the American church in the 1920s. American Protestants at this very moment were separating themselves out into opposing camps, fundamentalists and modernists, right? This is all happening right around the same time. Now, it might surprise you to learn that Bushnell, this intrepid feminist reformer, identified as a fundamentalist, because she was devoted to upholding the authority of the scriptures as she understood it. However, most fundamentalists, you will not be surprised to hear, were not all that eager to embrace women's rights. And so with this division, what we see happening is a closing off of opportunities that were once available to Christian women, particularly to evangelical women, particularly to those who still held relatively conservative views on the authority of the scriptures. Bushnell was not alone. A lot of Christian women found themselves in the 1920s kind of caught between these two polarizing groups. They wanted biblical Christianity, respect for the authority of the scriptures, and a progressive social vision, including for women. Which brings us to Madeline Southard. Madeline Southard is another remarkable Christian leader who lamented the polarization of American Christianity. She was a preacher, an advocate for women's ecclesiastical rights in the Methodist Church throughout much of the 20th century, and in the 1920s she founded the International Association of Women Ministers. Yes, there was an Association of Women Ministers back in the 1920s already. It was an organization that brought together female pastors of various denominations. They published a newsletter, which we still have access to today. It's a wonderful resource. They held annual conferences, and many of these women were pastors of small churches across the states, including many from the Midwest. So Southard also happened to leave behind an extensive set of diaries. And in these diaries, she poured out her heart. At one point, in her struggling to come to terms with the changing world around her, she suggested that the fundamentalist modernist split would not have happened if women had had more power in American churches at that time. And honestly, I think she's right. But women like Bushnell and Southard did not have the power to shape the conversation. They weren't pastors of distinguished churches, and they didn't hold prestigious seminary positions. Their books were not published by illustrious publishers with good marketing teams. It turns out even in the more liberal and mainline churches at this time, men continued to hold on to power. But I want us to just think for a moment how American Christianity and American history might look different if these two factions had held together, the modernists and the fundamentalists, and how we might be looking at a different world today. Okay, so transitioning. American history, through all of its twists and turns, is filled with Christian women leaders, with preachers and theologians and activists, women who led their churches, who led national and international organizations, who shaped the history of American Christianity up to a point, and American history more broadly. But you hadn't heard of most of these women, right? What happened? We already have a few clues, but I'm going to jump ahead for a little bit and tell you another story. And this one is from the 1970s. So, in the 1970s, we see the resurgence of feminism. This is called often second wave feminism. In the wake of the 19th Amendment, the women's rights movement did not actually disappear. We don't have like a complete break. But it did lose coherence as women who got the vote pursued a variety of different causes at the time. And then we had the Great Depression, and that disrupted things. Then we had World War II, and then the Cold War, and the post-war prosperity. And it really wasn't until the 1960s, and then especially in the 1970s, that women come together again, and kind of the women's rights movement returns in full force. So again, this is what is often referred to as second wave feminism. Now, at that same time, in the 1970s, we see the emergence of evangelical feminism. And this was connected to the larger women's rights movement, but it also had deep, deep roots in earlier evangelical feminism, in this history that had been lost, in the writings of Christian women that went back literally centuries. So one of the leading evangelical feminists in the 1970s was a woman by the name of Patricia Gundry. Anybody familiar with Patricia Gundry? Oh man, this is making a historian sad. Okay, a couple of you are nodding yes. Okay, this is recent history now. But again, the question is, why haven't you? And the clues are here. So Pat Gundry was born into a Southern Baptist family. As a young woman, she read de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. She was more impressed with de Beauvoir than with Friedan. But even before then, even before reading quote-unquote secular feminism, she had been trying to reconcile Bible verses that seemed to contradict each other. I'm guessing many of you have probably gone through a period in your own life in which you've done the same. And she went to a lot of people for answers, including a lot of male pastors, but she kept getting brushed off, and sometimes quite rudely. Why are you even asking that, she was told. Don't even go there. At a certain point, it occurred to Pat that maybe these women didn't actually know how to reconcile the seeming contradictions. And yet, they were willing to limit all women's lives and participation on the basis of Bible passages they know are problematic and they don't, in fact, know how to interpret. So she set off to find the answers herself. In 1977, she published this book, Woman Be Free. At first, it didn't make a huge splash because most Christian bookstore owners at the time were quite conservative, and they decided that they'd rather not stock this particular title. But it slowly began to catch on. Now, her husband, Stan Gundry, was at the time a professor at Moody Bible Institute. You guys have heard of Moody Bible Institute, kind of epicenter of evangelicalism in Chicago. 2 years after her book was published, so in 1979, she was invited to be a speaker at an all-day women's event, so an event kind of like this, speaking on the subject of her book. She had also been invited to give 2 interviews on Moody Radio on related topics. Then, however, the Stop ERA movement, remember what I talked about my own memories back in the 1970s? We're back in the 1970s here, full circle. And there's a Stop ERA movement that was pressuring Moody Bible Institute to come out and publicly oppose the ERA. And as they were pressuring Moody Bible Institute, and Moody Bible Institute wasn't coming out yet with a statement, their attention was drawn